Okay, so we've just started the live stream on YouTube. We will send you the link, the YouTube link, and that will be the recording of this meeting. So so you can pass along that link to everyone in your towns who you think might be interested in watching the presentation. All right, it is 7:04. So I think we should get started. All right. All right. Welcome. My name is Sam Gold. I'm the Executive Director of RiverCOG, and I want to welcome you to our public launch of our regional housing plan for the Lower Connecticut River Valley region. You probably saw some of our outreach material or participated in our survey or found our website or some of our social media posts to get here today. You might be brand new to housing and housing planning, or you might be quite involved, whether if you are RPC or your local planning and zoning commission. But we're happy that you could join us. We have a pretty robust presentation for you tonight, and we have a lot to get through. But we will reserve some time at the end of the presentations for comments. We will also have some interactive components to this presentation for you to give us some feedback. And what we're going to do is put the link to the project website and to the project email address in the chat box. This presentation, if you do have to leave before the presentation is complete, we want to make sure that you have the link to the website and to our email, so you can watch the recording, to watch whatever you might have missed, or pass that along to other members of your community, or to send us your comments. So, all right, with that, I'm going to introduce the project team. So this is a project of the Lower Connecticut River Valley Council of Governments. And our RiverCOG project manager is Senior Planner Megan Jouflas, who will be taking over the presentation from me in a moment. Also joining us on tonight's workshop, we have Janice Erlenmeyer. I think I also saw Kevin Armstrong, Margot Burns, and Elizabeth Presti, Torrance Downs, and
Ben Lovejoy is here too.
Oh, and Ben Lovejoy. That's it. I think that covers it for RiverCOG staff.
Paula.
Oh, and Paula Fernald. Sorry, Paula. And then we have a consultant team comprised of SLR, which is Liz Esposito and Robert Collins. We also have Goman+York, and that is going to be Don Poland, and Tyche Planning, and that's John Kuskowski. All of them are joining us as well tonight. Because of the massive undertaking that this project represents, we are really pleased to have such a talented team working on our regional housing plan. And each of our three consultants plus the RiverCOG staff bring their own strengths to the process. With that, I'm going to turn over. Let's go to the project agenda, tonight's agenda, and I'll turn it over to Megan. So I don't think the presentation has been up. So
yeah. No, but thank you. So let's see, Liz, if you could skip forward for me 2 slides to the agenda slide. Great. Thank you. So as Sam mentioned, my name is Megan Jouflas. I'm Senior Planner with RiverCOG and also the Project Manager for the Regional Housing Plan. We have a lot to cover tonight, so we're going to move at a pretty quick clip. We'll begin tonight's presentation with a little bit of background on the Regional Housing Plan, what it is, what it isn't, and what our intended objectives are for this process. Next, you'll hear from our consultant, Don Poland with Goman+York, regarding some of the regional demographic and housing market trends that will inform the housing analysis for this plan. At the conclusion of this presentation, you'll be given opportunities to participate with polling questions. We'll explain the procedure for the polling when the first question comes up. Following Don's presentation, we'll go over why these trends are important and how they can shape our thinking about the region's housing. And our consultant, Liz Esposito of SLR, will show you the preliminary results for our housing survey and discuss how public perception relates to our data and what that means for our project approach. Finally, we'll wrap up by reviewing the project timeline, our next steps, and additional ways that you can participate. Next slide. Getting into the substance, I think a good place for us to begin is to identify what a regional housing plan is. What does that mean? Well, a regional housing plan is generally what it sounds like, a plan to address overall housing needs at the regional level. This isn't something that's commonly done in the state of Connecticut, but it is done in other parts of the country. And the reason for this is because housing issues, housing markets, housing trends cross municipal boundaries. Where people live, where they work, and where they recreate don't often fit neatly within the confines of a single town, and each municipality in the region has something to offer to the overall picture. By coordinating our efforts, we can create a plan that reflects the synergistic relationship of all of our towns and better serve our regional population. In addition, a regional housing plan can build a foundation of regional knowledge, which can assist all of our towns in furthering important housing objectives. Next slide. So why take the regional approach? I said a little bit about this already, but really, we're taking a regional approach to housing as a second step to our Regional Plan of Conservation and Development, or RPOCD. The RPOCD was adopted last month and is available to view on RiverCOG's website for those interested, and I'd highly encourage everyone who hasn't seen it already to check it out. The RPOCD contains several recommendations related to creating diverse housing options for a diverse population. However, the recommendations are pretty high level. Through the planning process, we heard a lot of feedback requesting additional data on housing and additional guidance in addressing housing issues. This regional housing plan is an answer to those requests. We're also using the plan as an opportunity to zoom out and assess housing needs in a larger context. We understand that housing needs, and particularly affordable housing needs, don't exist in a vacuum. Rather, they're a symptom of the overall health and resiliency of our population and of our economy. And that's why we'll be examining trends in all of these areas in order to inform our housing recommendations. Next slide. So that brings us to the question, for who? Who are we creating this housing plan for? We're considering everyone's needs. So in addition to regional trends, as part of this project, we'll be looking at housing needs holistically. That means we won't limit our analysis to just one specific group. Naturally, affordability will be an important component of the plan. We'll be considering housing needs for a variety of income groups and household types, but it will only be part of the larger overall picture. Having a comprehensive housing approach that assesses housing needs for everyone in the context of our demographic and economic reality can help us strengthen the diversity, resiliency, and vitality of the region. Next slide. So logistically, how will we accomplish this? The plan is going to be formulated in two parts. The first part is a regional housing analysis, and the second part will consist of the town-specific 830J affordable housing plans. And I'll speak more on that in a minute, so bear with me. But next slide. So the regional housing analysis is what we're working on right now. That's part one. When it's complete, it will contain all of the things I've just mentioned. It will provide an overview of the current housing conditions in the region and project the region's future housing needs. It will consider housing market geography, housing demand drivers such as jobs, household formation, and income, our housing supply characteristics, and our changing demographics. The regional housing analysis will assess the linkage between all of these things in order to formulate a plan to meet our future housing needs. Next slide. As I mentioned previously, the regional housing analysis will not just be an affordable housing plan per se, but it will consider housing affordability and housing needs at a variety of price points for a variety of people as part of the overall housing picture. The main goal of this first part of the plan is to assess current and projected future housing in the region, particularly as it relates to job growth and demographic changes, and to make recommendations about how and where regional housing supply needs to change in order to address these conditions. At the conclusion of the regional housing analysis will be a set of policy recommendations to help municipalities better address a wide range of housing objectives and needs. Next slide. The following housing objectives grew out of the Regional Plan of Conservation and Development, and they're aimed at supporting overall diversity, resiliency, and vitality in our region. They are to diversify the region's population in terms of age, race, and socioeconomic status, create a resilient workforce in the region, ensure that people who work in the region can live near their jobs, to diversify housing stock for non-traditional households, to examine ways to make existing housing stock, office, and retail space in the region function for a changing population, and to encourage orderly creation of housing of different styles and types throughout the region near existing areas of development, employment, and transit. Next slide. Thank you. On completion of the regional housing analysis, we'll move into part 2 of the regional housing plan, the 830J affordable housing plans. 830J is a statute which requires that every 5 years, the towns adopt an affordable housing plan to show how they intend to increase their number of affordable housing developments. There are 12 municipalities in the region that are creating their 830J plans in concert with this regional process. These towns are Portland, Cromwell, Middletown, East Hampton, East Haddam, Chester, Deep River, Essex, Killingworth, Clinton, Old Lyme, and Lyme. Each town will take the lead in the creation of their plan with varying degrees of support from our consultant team. The 830J plans for these towns will be attached as annexes to the regional housing analysis. Next slide. The 830J plans will focus specifically on housing affordability in each participating town and will build on the recommendations in the regional housing analysis. Each 830J plan will be created with significant town input and will be tailored to the town's preferred approach. Much more information on these 830J plans will follow as we wrap up the regional portion of the plan, and we'll go over more for the timeline and the next steps at the end of the presentation. So please continue to stay tuned and visit the project website often for updates. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Don Poland, our consultant from Goman+York. Don has been hard at work collecting and analyzing market and demographic data for our regional housing analysis, and he'll be sharing his findings with you tonight. And I'd like to reiterate before Don gets started that this information is important to inform the context through which we look at housing. We need to understand the totality of circumstances of where we are so that we can make informed decisions about where we're going, and also to redirect our course if needed. Don?
Thank you, Megan. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. So I have a number of slides to go through with quite a bit of data. I'm going to try and boil it down to the most important points and simplify it as much as possible. So I want to start off with just kind of providing an understanding of how housing markets organize and function. So understanding housing markets, essentially metropolitan areas are labor markets. That is, persons and firms locate in the metropolitan area for employment opportunities. This creates a symbiotic relationship between the place of home and the place of work. And ultimately, we always like to say housing is where jobs go at night. So the spatial organization, location of housing within the metropolitan area determines accessibility to employment. And that's the key. It's about accessibility to places of employment. Therefore, more centrally located places of home and are more accessible to employment opportunities. And then ultimately, commute times also help to inform us about kind of time, distance, and accessibility. Next slide. So in this graphic here, there's 6 circles. If you look at the bottom left-hand circle, we can basically assume, and in this graphic, it's saying that the commute time, maximum commute time within this hypothetical metropolitan region is 1 hour. And if you lived out at the right-hand side or the eastern fringe of this region, in a 1 hour commute time, you would be able to access about 40% of the total jobs within the marketplace. The top right circle, that's all orange with the multiple dots in it, then basically assumes if you're located at the center of the region with a 1 hour commute time, you could essentially reach 100% of the jobs within the job market. This is essentially the dynamics of accessibility and becomes key when we look at your region specifically. Next slide. So spatial and economic organization of housing markets, density is typically highest near the center and decreases with distance from the center. And income, as income increases, land consumption and floor area consumption increase. So if we look at the two charts on the right-hand side, we see that density decreases with distance from the core, and income, as income increases, consumption of land and floor area increase. Key here is this is not just, sprawling out into suburbia where as income increases, land and floor area increases. If you look at Manhattan, you will see that the wealthiest persons live in the largest apartments, and so forth and so on. So ultimately, wealthy households consume more land, more floor area than households of lesser means. There are exceptions to these rules. The amenity value of a place can distort these trajectories. And the same with a small urban center. And in the context of metropolitan Hartford, Middletown is one of those small urban centers that creates some distortion. It becomes a sub-market or a sub-center within the region. Next slide. So land value or rent is highest near the center and lowest near the periphery. This is basically a factor of accessibility. The more accessible to the job market, the higher the value. So a household of a given income can access a larger home, essentially floor area, on more land, a larger lot, further from the center. And housing costs adjust for location. So the example at the bottom here, per square foot values. This house in the lower right-hand side is essentially a house I once owned. It was in Stafford Springs, and from my front door to downtown Hartford was exactly a half hour without traffic. And I went on to MLS, the multiple listing service, and I looked for comparable sales in other communities nearer to the core, South Windsor being one and West Hartford being another. And what we find is those comparable sales, same number of square footage, same number of bathrooms, number of bedrooms, 2-car garage, adjustments for land, because this was nearly 3 acres and you're just not going to find that nearer the core. With adjusting for land, you see the values go from 136 a square foot up to 195 a square foot for a comparable property nearer to the core. This is essentially that function of accessibility. Someone in West Hartford or South Windsor has greater access to more of the job market than ultimately someone out at the fringe in Stafford Springs. Next slide. So, Lower Connecticut River Valley is periphery of the 3 metropolitan areas. Essentially, communities within the region are divided across 3 metro regions. And essentially, I just did this graphic with the region in the center and through 3 circles based on kind of proportionate to the size of the regions, Hartford being the largest metro region, New Haven the second, and New London the third. And basically what we see is that your region exists primarily at the periphery of 3 regions. That's not surprising to me, someone doing this analysis, but it becomes important in the context of what we're going to see in additional analysis on further slides. Next slide, please. So, recognizing that housing markets are labor markets, we wanted to ultimately look at jobs and job opportunities in the region. So we basically mapped into the regions in these 3 green shaded areas. The top left is the area of your region that's within the metropolitan Hartford. The bottom left is within metropolitan New Haven, and the bottom right is within metropolitan New London, kind of recognizing these 3 submarkets for the metropolitan region that they're within. So we mapped large employers. First, there was a positive aspect to this. We thought we were going to be using thresholds of 500 plus employees and 100 plus employees. What we found is you have some large companies with high employment numbers within your region. So we use 250 and 1,000 as the thresholds and then map them. What we find is the overwhelming majority of those large employers exist within the Metro Hartford area, primarily within Middletown. And therefore, we start to see a housing market that's organized around the northern end of the region, more so than the southern end. To further quantify this, next slide, we did some what's called geofencing. This is a software that gives us access to cell phone pings off of cell phone towers. So we know where people were, and we know the duration of time that they may have been in a location. And we also know essentially where they live. And we mapped the Middlesex corporate center. And the little inset on the lower left, that is all the pings within that location. And then all the red dots on the large map are the likely places of home for all those pings in the smaller blue map. Next slide. We did this again for Middlesex Hospital, is another large employer. And once again, we see this dispersion. Third one we did, another large employer, next slide, was Pratt & Whitney. With Pratt & Whitney, you see a much wider dispersion, and I think that's due to longevity. I think it's also due to the relocation over time of jobs out of East Hartford into the Middletown facility and so forth. But ultimately, in all three of these maps, we see a predominance of kind of persons entering the region from north, or being place of home being north of the region. And if you go to the next slide, this is then combines the data from the three. And once again, we see here the lower Connecticut River Valley region, the lower portion in the coastal areas are producing the least amount of employees into the largest job center up in Middletown. We see the highest concentration of jobs, place of residence coming from Middletown and the immediate adjacent communities. And we also see the dispersion of persons entering into the region for employment at those three centers, primarily oriented, more towards the north than to the south, showing the dominance of the Metro Hartford region into this region. Next slide. So we looked at the metropolitan regions and broke them out by fair market rents. This is kind of to start leading into the later affordable housing work. And this is basically a summary of some of the demographic data in this top chart here, that we see the largest concentration of population and households existing within the Hartford communities that make up the Hartford metro communities that make up the northern portion of your regions. We see median age is lowest in the north and highest in the southern communities. Average household size overall are relatively low, but nothing of much concern. And we see income increase as we move from the northern portion of the region down into the southern portion of the region. That is median household income. Same with median household values. And typically we see that income follows the same trajectory as values, and that makes sense. And we see the average age of housing. And I'll just set up here for kind of a lead into some later data is your housing stock is old. The median age or the median year built of your housing is pushing back into the 1960s and the early 1970s. And that is an old housing stock. We'll see some other data later. The lower chart here is just then a breakdown of kind of your housing characteristics compared to the state. And we see here that 71.3% of the housing in the region is single family detached, compared to the state at 58.9. So this higher level of single family detached housing. Once again, not a surprising finding based on understanding your region, but ultimately showing that there's a greater dependence on this style of housing. It also becomes important as we move through this presentation. 20 units or more, your conventional large, multifamily development, only making up 5.4% compared to 8.8% for the state. If you actually look at this table, if you look at all the percent values, ultimately the region runs lower. Other than the single family detached, the region runs lower than all the state averages. So we see a less diversity in your housing stock than, say, the average for Connecticut. Next slide. So As Megan already kind of mentioned as a lead-in, but now more specifically, when we're talking about housing markets, when we're talking about any market, we have to talk about demand drivers. And the primary demand driver is jobs. Places that are growing jobs are typically growing in other ways. So if a place is growing jobs, then it's most likely growing population. It's most likely experiencing household formations, and typically is seeing some degree of income growth. Here in Connecticut, since approximately 1990, or over the past 3 decades, we have seen stagnant job growth. It's statewide, it's not just your region, but we're flat, we're not growing jobs. So our primary demand driver is weak. Population growth has been mostly anemic. Connecticut overall had marginal increases in population, mostly based in Fairfield and Hartford, Fairfield County and Hartford County, with contractions in many of the smaller counties. And we'll talk more about the specifics of that in your region. Household formations, I truly believe they've been modest in Connecticut, and I truly believe that it is household formations that are the primary driver of our housing market over the past 30 years. And I'll talk more about that as I move through this. Income at the end of the day, I don't believe drives housing, but it kind of tells us at what price points where market demand will be realized. And ultimately, income growth has been somewhat anemic in the state over the past 3 decades. Next slide. So from a statewide perspective, our demand drivers are not painting a pretty picture for the housing market overall. So some data here, because now we're talking about, if we go back and think about the housing characteristics, the style of housing available in your community, and then the demographics of population and how that relates to demand drivers and ultimately demand for housing. So the top left graph here is households by type for the United States from 1970 to 2012. This is one of my favorite graphics because it's something in everyday life we don't see, and it's important to understand. In 1970, 40% of households were married couples with children. By 2012, that number dropped to 19.6%. And today it's around 17%. If you also look at that table, the next column, the next bars up, married couples without children, statistically that stayed constant through this whole period of approximately 30%. So then when you look above that, other households, men living alone, women living alone, and non-family households, that's where we see the changes. So as the married couples with children contracted, the women and men living alone ultimately expanded. And that ultimately has been the driver of household formations. So the top right chart is actually just looking at the number of persons per household or household size over this period. And we see the most dramatic increase in the one-person household from 17% in 1970 to 27% in 2012. Two-person households, 28.9 to 33.8. And then it's in those upper categories of 3, 4, and 5-person households where we see contraction. So household size is contracting. The demographics of households are changing. And the fact is we have less families with children than we ever previously did before. And that means the typical home buyer or even renter is changing. And that's why we'll see changes in the market overall. The bottom right-hand graph shows us that household growth has trailed behind population growth for the first time since 2010. Prior to that, it was always ahead. This is a big concern of mine, is that if household formations have been our primary driver of the housing market in Connecticut, that ultimately this contraction and now household growth trailing behind population growth, that starts to raise a concern for me that our only strong demand driver is actually weakening. Next slide. So population findings. Now we're looking at your individual region. The chart on the right-hand side gives you Connecticut totals for a total population between 2010 and 2020. I then provide Hartford County, Middlesex County, and New London County as comparatives. and then each of the communities within your region. And what we see here ultimately, we already know from the demand drivers, total population growth within the region is, anemic. And we know statewide job growth is stagnant. You guys are no different. Ultimately, these population losses, from my perspective, threaten the region's housing market and socioeconomic well-being. So weak demand drivers undermine the region's ability to attract and retain young households. We'll see more of that in the next two following slides, I believe. And loss of young persons and aging population will reduce demand for housing, especially large single-family detached. Basically, if nothing changes between now and the 2030 census over the next 10 years, you're going to actually see a bleaker picture at that point in time. Now, in Connecticut, since population growth has been stagnant, I'm used to seeing 1% declines in population in communities. I'm somewhat used to seeing 2% declines, but when I start seeing those 3 and 5% declines, it starts raising a bit of a red flag for me of maybe a greater weakness here than across the state as a whole. Next slide. So this next slide looks specifically at population under 18 years of age from 2010 to 2020. Your region, so while your region lost only 1% in total population, you lost 19% of your persons under 18. 7,000 children evaporated from your region. This indicates declining household size and loss of young family households, challenges the region's ability to compete for young persons and families, retention and attraction of young persons and young families, foreshadows future population loss if nothing changes. The fact is you're aging, and to be blunt, the oldest persons in the region will die off over the next 10 years, correct? And if there are fewer young persons coming behind them, you will continue to age. And you lost 19% of your youngest age cohort. Question, who will be the next generation of home buyers if the region can't retain and attract young persons and families? This has to be on the table as a concern. If you're losing young persons and young families, who are going to buy your homes moving forward or rent your apartments? Housing and grand list values will decline if supply outpaces demand. I don't think supply is outpacing demand. I think this shed of population in both total population and in young persons is a contraction in household sizes and the demographic structure of the population. But if it continues for another 10 years, you will see a contraction in households, meaning that supply will start outpacing demand. Next slide, please. So on the right-hand side, this chart gives you the median age by town. Connecticut, as we see up top, median age in the United States is 38. Connecticut is an older state at 41. Hartford County tracking the state, basically. Middlesex is a little bit younger, and New London County is a little bit older. But then look at your individual communities. No one, every single one of your communities is above 43 years of age for median age. So you are, what, 5 years older median than the United States. That's dramatic. You're 3 years older than the state. That's dramatic. And then we'll see you actually have communities that have median ages above 50. Could you please mute yourself? You have median ages above 50. That is actually really old. Sorry to say it. And don't assume that millennials will save the region. I often find that we give too much credit or too much attention to the millennial generation, that there's all these young people who are coming along and they're going to rescue everything. At the end of the day, they're trending behind Generation X in births. And that's what this graphic shows here. Percent of women giving birth by birth cohort in age. And basically the peak of kind of the peak year or age for giving birth is around 28, 29. The millennials peaked lower than Gen X, and they're continuing to trend lower than Gen X year by year. And half your millennials are already over this peak year of childbirth. So the likelihood of them producing a large cohort of children coming forward is next to nil at this point. Next slide, please. So whenever I'm doing a housing market analysis and housing study, I always look at housing permits. The State Department of Economic and Community Development has some great data on housing permits, and it gives me the ability to look at past trends to try and understand where we are, but also to try and predict or project going forward what assumption rates might be. It basically tells me how many houses over this 21-year period have been absorbed into your region. And what we see here, what was interesting here is the data didn't surprise me at first when I first started looking at it. Total numbers, I guess, made sense, and the percents of total at the bottom made sense. But it's when I split the regions down the middle in time and did pre-2007 or 2008 and then post-2008. So housing production findings between 1997 and 2017, the whole time span, you absorbed 494 new housing units into the region per year. If you pull Middletown out of the equation, it's 369. But in the first half, from 97 to 2007, you absorbed 769 housing units per year, 581 if you pull Middletown out of the equation. But then look at what happens in 2008 to 2017. You drop to 191 units per year. Now, we all know the housing market tanked in 1998. We all know Connecticut in 2008. We all know Connecticut's permits per year plummeted after 2008. But to see this play out in kind of year over year data, this is really dramatic. Also, Middletown accounts for 25% of your region's net gain in housing, and 81% of the multifamily housing that's been net gained over this period of time. Less Middletown, 93.3% of your new construction is single family, and 4.1% of new construction is multifamily. Declining demand, net gain of 8,400 units in the first half of this time period up till 2007. And only a net gain of 1,900 units in the second half. That is 81.6% of your housing was built pre-2008, going back to 97. Multifamily market share in each of these time periods, 16% overall, 14% in the first half, and 30% in the second half. This tracks with multifamily housing share overall, and I'll speak about that in a moment. So if I had to project absorption moving forward, kind of what can your region be anticipated to bear? I use the early period as the high. I use the middle period, the later period, or the whole period as the middle, and then the later period, 2008 to 17, as the low. I then say, you know, from a planning perspective, if you are planning from housing, I think the most you can assume is about 300 units per year moving forward with this housing plan. That's not a lot spread across how many communities. Next slide. So this graphic is new privately owned housing units constructed in Connecticut by type. 1 unit, 5 or more, 2 to 4, and then the historic average there. So basically 1 unit, 2 to 4 middle housing, and then 5 or more multifamily housing. And it's from 1960 all the way through to 2018. And what we see is kind of pre-1990, we used to build a lot of housing in Connecticut. You can see the economic downturns, the oil embargo, an issue in the early 1970s, the small recession, and as we turned into the 1980s, we bounced back in the 80s. The market crash in 1989-90 with the recession of 90-91. But it's at that point where we flattened. We stopped building a lot of housing. We stayed that way mostly for a decade and a half, almost 2 decades. And then the 2008 market crash happened, and we dropped again and we flattened again. Resilient places bounce back. Connecticut's showing signs of not being resilient in the context of housing. Where I have the red circle on the right-hand side here, this is a key change. So I said your multifamily development within the region increased from 16% to 30% in the most recent years. And we see this in Connecticut. Actually, the percent of multifamily as total new construction of housing in Connecticut has gone from 24% around 2006 to 47% of the housing market in 2020. So we've shifted away from single family residential detached towards multifamily. And that's direct relationship to the changes in demographic structure, smaller household size, more single persons living alone. 1960 America, 13% of households were single persons. Today, 28% of America is single persons. So that is the changing housing market. That's why demand is leaning more, even though our demand's anemic, it's leaning more towards multifamily than single family. Next slide. So demographics and school enrollment findings. Since there was such a plummet in the young persons under the age of 18, I wanted to also take a look at school enrollments to see how, to kind of justify the plummet in the young population, but to see how it was tracking by town. So the region has lost 1% of its total population, 19% of persons under 18, and 21.4% of school district enrollments. The region gained 10,377 housing units, 83% of which were single family. And at the same time, you lost 7,000 persons under 18, and you lost 5,123 school enrollments. For every new housing unit built in your region that you gained, net gained, the region lost 2.67 enrollments. Now, when I'm before land use commissions on development applications, I'm usually told that every new housing unit is going to produce 1 or 2 school-age children. It's not the case in the normal market, but it's truly not the case in your market. You've lost 2.6 children enrollments, 2.6 school enrollments per every housing unit constructed. So look at the data on the right-hand side. Look at those drops, 46% in Deep River, 34.8% in East Haddam, 43% in Essex. These are huge plummets. As I said previously, not only have young persons evaporated in your region, but your school enrollments have evaporated also. So considerations. With a family-oriented housing stock, primarily single-family residential detached on larger lots, in contracting family households, who will be the next generation of home buyers in your region? How does the region attract young persons and families when the housing stock, the housing product, doesn't match consumer needs and wants? Today, the next generation of home buyers are your renters, yet the region offers very few rental and multifamily options outside of Middletown. So you don't have a baked-in population for your next generation of home buyers because you don't have a lot of rentals. Without a homegrown renter population, the region must attract home buyers from outside the region. But what we find is people are moving less and they're moving less distance. So how will the region compete with communities that offer better accessibility, more diverse housing, and greater amenities? Next slide. We're almost near the end here, so sorry for the huge data dump on you. So this is a recent survey by the National Association of Realtors and findings on key trends in the 2021 housing market. So key findings that are relevant to you guys. Most common type of home purchase continues to be a detached single family home. That's the one bright spot for you. There's still demand for the single family home, which made up 81% of all homes bought. It was most common among all generations. That's great. However, buyers 22 to 30, the next generation of home buyers, purchase townhomes at a higher share than other age groups. And this starts to show the changing trends within the housing market as what younger households are looking for versus older households versus the existing housing stock. Millennials were more likely than other buyers to purchase in urban areas. I would interpret this as urban and suburban areas nearer the core, more so than the periphery, more rural areas. Convenience to their jobs and commuting costs were both important to this group. Another consideration to be made in the context of your periphery regions. There was only a median of 15 miles from home that recent buyers previously resided in the homes that they purchased. And actually among 22 to 55-year-olds, 10 miles was the median move. This is the whole issue. People are moving less and they're moving shorter distances, making attracting new buyers into your region more challenging. The typical home recently purchased was 1,900 square feet, not bad, and had 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and was built in 1993. That's where we see your housing stock being very old. Remember, your median ages were back in the 1960s and 70s. 1993 is a much newer product that's being purchased. Size of homes for buyers 41 to 55, 2,100 square feet. Not a bad number also for your region with a larger single family detached housing stock. However, compared to buyers 22 to 30, we then see the average size drop, the median size drop to 1,650. It's actually the eldest buyers that buy larger square footage in homes. So for buyers 22 to 29, commuting costs were very important at 44%. The largest consideration to the youngest buyers is commuting costs. And you can translate that into time and distance, which raises my concern about the periphery character of your region. Next slide. So why housing matters? There's a symbiotic relationship between economic development and housing. As I already said, housing is where jobs go at night. If the region does not have housing to meet the needs of the labor force, it will become increasingly difficult to attract and maintain jobs. For the region to be competitive, it must provide a housing stock, a housing product that meets the needs and wants of the consumers. And I'm fearful that you're not matching up good. The region's housing stock was built for past generations with larger households, families, and children. Tomorrow's home buyers are today's renters. I've already said this. With very few rental opportunities, you lack a pool of future buyers, and ultimately will have to struggle to try and attract from outside the region. The region's housing stock does not match well with recent home buyer trends. All data presented here points to a softening demand and a weakening housing market, and supply will likely outstrip demand, weakening home values and grand list values if things don't change. There's this saying in demography that demographics are destiny. Yes, if nothing changes, but we have the ability to change, and if we change, we can actually move demographics. We can actually move a marketplace. So I don't think we're condemned to this kind of bleak future I'm talking about, but that there's an opportunity to change what we're doing to get an alternative future by, say, 2030. Next slide, please. So the impacts of COVID. I know some of you are going to push back and say, well, COVID and all these people are moving to rural places and want large space. Yes, I agree. And I've been tracking it from the beginning. So the pandemic has impacted Connecticut's housing market in a positive way. But the following are some thoughts and perspectives. Demand for single-family detached housing is up and prices are rising. They're starting to flatten a bit, but they're rising, and they have been tremendously. That's why I sold the house in Stafford Springs. COVID relocations and the desire for space, floor area, and land has contributed to overall demand. I can't deny that. But I think more of the housing market bump is being pushed by millennials finally entering the home buying market. And I think that's a significant contributor. And then at the end of the day, it's the low interest rates and the limited supply that's really driving demand and price value. If you look at that graphic on the top right there, new versus sold, Look at from 2016 on to 2021, the contracting supply of houses listed on the market for sale. Both listings and sales are down. That's where the price is going up. It's the limited supply available for purchase. So then price appreciation is greatest in communities with good accessibility and amenities. Basically, this map in the lower right is showing us where appreciation is highest in the darkest colors and lowest in the lightest colors. And you kind of see a big light hole in the middle of your region. Sorry about that. I didn't make this map, I'm just presenting it. But at the end of the day, you can see that periphery character of the region, that the core areas are feeling the benefits greater than the periphery areas. First and second ring suburbs have benefited the most, and that will continue. And the COVID housing market will soften, or is softening, will continue to soften. Values will contract and supply and demand will come back into balance in time. It's probably another year for full correction. It's going to be slow, but it's going to happen. And long-term benefits to the region, I think, are kind of unlikely. Yeah, you're getting a little bump, but I don't see it as a prolonged substantial benefit. So last slide, I believe, is the next one. I want to end on affordable housing. As Megan said, we're moving towards the affordable housing portion of this, and she'll be talking more about schedule later. But I wanted to set up for those local affordable housing, kind of this regional look at affordable housing and need. So affordable housing need in the region is real and important in the long-term social and economic vitality of the region. The following are key data points regarding affordable housing in the region. 31% of households pay more than 30% of their income on housing. That 30% is kind of the threshold. Households paying more than 30%, housing is unaffordable. Paying less, housing is affordable. So you see almost a third of your population experiencing a degree of housing being unaffordable. 26% of those are homeowners, and 48.4% of those populations are renters. So the affordability issue is much more in the rental housing than it is the home ownership housing, but you can't necessarily ignore the home ownership stuff. It's in both at meaningful levels. Housing affordability is an issue for homeowners over $75,000 a year in median income. And at the end of the day, those households have choice. If they're over 75, meaning they could opt for cheaper housing, they're making some type of decision not to. I have some concern there. You definitely need a housing product targeting that income group, but it's not the biggest concern. Greatest need for affordable homeowner housing is at incomes between 50 and 75,000, between 64% and 96% regional median income. Essentially, this is your middle class housing. These are your school teachers and police officers and so forth that are having the greatest struggles with housing affordability. And that's where, on the home ownership side, there's a definite need here for a product that serves that population. Greatest need for affordable rental housing is at incomes below $50,000 or below 64% regional median income, which is $78,000 per year. This is not, don't think you're different. Time and time again, when I do this research, the greatest need for rental housing is at incomes at 50% and below. That's not unusual. But it's a key point to understand that rental housing at an affordable price is really needed when you have 48% of your renters struggling. Housing need at incomes of 60% regional median income can be addressed through inclusionary zoning. If you're looking at zoning as a strategy to better encourage affordable housing, at 60% median income, you can deal with the housing market through zoning regulations to a degree. At 80%, you can really deal with it through zoning. But housing needed incomes below 60% regional median income require other interventions beyond zoning. And what I mean by that is various state and federal programs that help subsidize this housing are definitely needed need to be in play for consideration. In addition, it's becoming common for municipalities to offer tax abatements on multifamily market and multifamily affordable. I've been involved in a dozen or so over the past 5 years. And the fact is, I think local government participation needs to be considered. So that's the overview of the regional housing market. I'll kick it back to Megan for transition, and I'll be available for Q&A, I believe, towards the end of this presentation tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Don. So thank you, everyone, also for bearing with us. I know that was a lot of information, and I hope it was interesting and enlightening for you as it was for us. And I know it doesn't necessarily look like it bodes well for our region, but I think, as Don mentioned, it's important to look at this as an opportunity. We're reading warning signs now while there's still time for us to make a change. So how does this shape the way that we look at the regional housing plan? Right now, the supply of housing we have doesn't match with our current housing needs. And on top of that, we're trying to generate new housing for a population that's shrinking. We have a really wonderful region with so much to offer, and we know this. So going back to our housing objectives, we need to think strategically about how to share this with a diversity of residents for the sake of our region's resiliency and economic well-being. Any housing we look to create should be aimed at supporting that goal. We need housing that will support the regional workforce we have and the regional workforce that we'd like to have. And per the Regional Plan of Conservation and Development, recommendations in the plan should be tied to supporting regional economic development and be supported by regional transportation goals in order to sustain the overall resiliency of the region. As I mentioned at the outset, housing needs do not exist in a vacuum. Next slide. And so now I'd like to turn things back over to our consultant, Liz Esposito with SLR, to get some feedback from you on what you've heard, and then to talk a little bit about the survey that was released as part of this project over the summer. Liz?
Thanks. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. We want to hear from you, so we're going to use some live polling software. So if you're on your computer, open up a new window or a new tab in Google or whatever search engine you use, type in pollev.com/SLR 2021. And if someone could drop that in the chat as well so people can click on it, that would be awesome. And you'll get to a black screen with the SLR logo on it. And we'll set up a test question to make sure everyone can get on board. So I'll give it just a minute. All right. Oh, here we go. People are already doing it. This is great. So as you can see, as you answer, we get to see what is rising to the top. It seems like you're you're big fans of chocolate tonight. So we can move on to something a little bit more relevant. It seems like everybody's got it working. We have, how many participants are we up to?
55.
Perfect. So pretty much everybody is able to use this. That's great. All right, let's go to our next question. So what best describes your relationship to the regional housing plan? Are you one of our volunteer housing liaisons? Do you live here? Are you employed at a business here? So pick something that, if you're a resident and a liaison, pick the liaison. So whatever you think makes you most involved with the plan. All right, we've got a pretty good mix so far. Answers are still coming in. And all of this is anonymous, so you don't have to worry about that. Should have mentioned that a little bit earlier. All right, anybody else? Oh, here we go, a couple more. All right, I think we're just about there. So most folks on the call tonight are residents or involved in a RiverCOG community. So that's great, or you're a member of a board or commission. So that's great. We've got a nice diverse crowd tonight. So we'll move to our next question. what community are you representing? So where you live in, where you're from. All right. Chester and East Hampton. Ooh, maybe just Chester's taking the lead. Anybody else? No?
I know we have Clinton. We have Clinton's represented, even if.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about Don's data. In a few words, a couple of adjectives. What's your reaction?
I'm scared about that.
Shocking, but not surprising. Surprised. Oh no. Disheartening, depressing, sobering, and scary. Bleak, thorough. That's a compliment. You got that one, Don.
These are all responses from Don's Rate My Professor, aren't they?
Oh no. Shots fired. All right. Worried.
I never check that.
Never read the comments. Concerned. Opportunity in crisis. That's a good one. Yeah, so I think we're seeing a lot of the same thing being repeated a little bit. Being kind of nervous about how this bodes for the region. Thought-provoking. So we're going to take this and hopefully move forward with it, maybe make it a little bit more optimistic by the end. So let's move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing survey that went out in September. We had about 1,300 responses, which was great. Nearly half of those were from Killingworth, so they get the gold star for the most participation. They're only 3% of the population, so clearly we have some skewing in this data. The survey responses are not meant to be gospel, but just kind of an indication of how people are feeling in the region and where we can go. So most of the smaller communities are oversampled, which isn't surprising when we do this kind of thing. But again, it's just something to note that this is not scientific. It is just to take the temperature of the region. So 50% of our respondents have lived in their community for over 20 years. 40% are over age 65. So even for a region that is a little bit older, the older populations were oversampled. So it follows that a large chunk of our respondents were retired. 62% were from households with 2 or fewer people. 91% live in a single family home and own it. 58% have incomes over 100,000. 64% of respondents anticipate being in the same household or the same size household in 5 years from now when the plans need to be updated. And 69% anticipate remaining in their current home and not moving or changing. And we included Killingworth in this because it was very close to the overall regional totals. And I also want to stress that I went through the IP addresses on this. There was no funny business. Nobody was stuffing the ballot box, so to speak. So we're pretty confident that these are individuals who are answering. So for the question, housing in the state, region, or community is too expensive. Our respondents mostly agreed at the state level it's too expensive, next the region, next their community. For the question, do you think affordable or attainable housing is an important component of your community's longevity? The majority said yes. So nearly 3/4 when we pulled Killingworth out, but still a majority when they're included. And full disclosure, I'm from Killingworth, so I may pick on them a little bit. So do you know anyone that would move to your community if they already live here, would they stay if it were more affordable? Again, we have just about the majority say that they know people who would be interested in living in the region if it were more affordable. So thinking of types of housing in your community, do you think there are enough options to meet current residents' needs? Sorry, our lights are motion sensor. The majority say no. With Killingworth included, it's just over half. When they're pulled out, 2/3 of respondents say no. Do you think the existing housing stock is adequate to satisfy future market demands? With Killingworth included, it's about half. When they're taken out, it's just over half. And these folks haven't seen Don's data, so I think that gray unsure slice of these pie charts would shrink one way or the other after that. So this is the one that I found most interesting. Does your community have not enough, too much, or about the right amount of housing choices for the following populations? So in either breakdown, the majority say there's not enough housing for young adults, low-income households, people living alone, renters, seniors, and local workers. So these are really the populations that when we get into the 830J annexes should be the focus. So how do each of your communities assist these populations or enable the construction of homes that would appeal or be attainable for these populations? Finally, not finally, but if your community had more diverse housing options, what impact would it have on the community? Positive, negative, or neutral? So with Killingworth, pull the average down, but without, there's still a majority saying that it would be positive. And what would those positive benefits be? So far and away, folks mentioned diversity. So when we talk about diversity in the context of this question, it's not just racial or ethnic diversity, it's age, it's socioeconomic, lifestyle. So a lot of the answers emphasize to that. Attracting young families, senior housing for seniors and people who are on a fixed income was also a large positive benefit. So I went through, we read them all, and it was very clear where folks who answered positively to this question where their head was at. So finally, in order to meet the housing needs of residents and workers, should the state or the COGs play a greater role? Most people would prefer the region to the state taking a larger role. So that kind of backs up what we're doing tonight, that RiverCOG is taking the lead here to chart this path forward. So we're going to do the same exercise again. In a few words, what's your reaction to the survey data? Does any of is it as surprising as the data that Don Pullen presented? Hopeful. All right. Optimistic. All right. So we get a little bit of a shift. Seems about right. Good. I mean, you could try. You could try to evict Killingworth. Yeah, so not enough responses from many communities. Yeah, so the survey is still open if people want to take it, and individual town survey reports will be presented and made available for those 830J annexes. So that's a good point. We're still looking at that. Oops. All right. Seems like we've plateaued a little bit, so we'll move on to our next question. So in this plan, it's very broad. So are there aspects that should be emphasized? So you can rank them, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. So for this one, you're going to have to click and drag each topic. The top is number 1, your highest priority, and at the bottom is your lowest priority. All right. And come on, don't be shy. There we go. We'll get a couple more.
This activity takes a little bit longer, so let's give it a little more time.
Yep, absolutely. And if you have any questions about what these categories are, feel free to pop it in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to help clarify that for you. Okay, I'm going to leave this one open and we can start a little bit of a discussion. So it looks like housing affordability is top ranked for right now. That could change with new answers coming in. Different kinds of housing types, demographic shifts, economic development, zoning guidance, legislative advocacy, and other. So would anyone like to tell us why you picked what you picked, or if you answered other, what you're thinking about with the other, so we can get a better idea of how you're thinking about this and what we can do to include that in the plan. Anybody?
So you just want us to speak up and answer, or is there a box that we should be typing into?
That is a good question. Megan, is there a raise hand function on this one, or is it an unmute kind
There
of
should
thing?
be a raise hand.
Okay. So in your Zoom bar, I'm assuming at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little hand icon that you can click on, and then we know that you'd like to talk.
It's in the reactions tab.
Thank you. Okay, if you're on a phone and you're having a little bit of trouble dragging stuff, you can email me and I will include your answers. Unfortunately, that one's it's a little tough to do on a phone. All right, so I'm gonna ask Laura to unmute.
Thank you.
Hi.
I would like to see this report address some of the incentives that Don Poland mentioned that could be in the toolbox for municipalities to attract some of this housing.
Great. Rob, you want to unmute?
Yeah, I think a slide back, you were showing something about diversity being the driving benefit that people identified for having I forget what the thing was, but I remember diversity was seen as the highest benefit. And I think if you look at this poll, the different kinds of housing types and housing affordability will help generate that diversity. So I think they're going hand in hand.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Oh, Alan?
You're still muted, Alan. Okay, now you're
Okay.
good.
He's working on it.
Yeah. Demographic shifts attract retention of new, younger residents. I think that's the key. It's new residents, younger, and to continue the tendency for people to retire here. They add to the revenues. The young people we just need. We need to keep more of the college-educated young people, particularly. That if you look at the demographics of the younger people moving out and you look at who they are, they're mostly college-educated. Go away to school and don't come home. Go away to school, come home for a year, and then move on to a job, employment in other areas. I think we need to focus on that element, and along with it, affordability.
Great, thank you. Humphrey?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It seems to me if we go back to Don's presentation, in which he said that housing is where jobs go at night. That if we want to be able to really mold and direct the future of housing in the area, the focus needs to be on jobs. So I would urge that folks consider economic development as one of the important emphasis of this regional plan.
Great. Yeah, and to clarify, so all of these topics will be addressed in the plan. It's just how much emphasis they get and how much page space, let's say. Any other comments? All right, well, of course, you can use the raise hand function if you think of other things or have questions. So let's move on from this. So our next steps with public participation, this is not your only opportunity. So for the 830J annexes, we're gonna have 12 virtual meetings in January and February, one with each of the towns that have requested these annexes. We'll be developing your community's value statement, reviewing individual town data, looking at the individual survey results, as well as gauging the appetite for different policies that your municipality could consider. So we'll be looking at different aspects of housing affordability. So why is that important to your community? Maybe looking at different strategies like ADUs, multifamily housing, scrutinizing subdivision regulations or lot size requirements, just to name a few. So as we move forward, keep thinking about what strategies your municipality could be interested in. And we hope to hear from you and see you at those individual meetings. We'll also have another regional meeting later in the winter to talk about different strategies that the COG can use as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Megan, who seems a little occupied, but
we have a guest visitor. This is true multitasking.
yes.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you so much. Those activities were really interesting, and I think woke everybody up a little bit too. So as you can see, this is a timeline that shows where we're going from here. We kicked off the project in May, and we're currently wrapping up with the regional data analysis. Under task 5, you can see that beginning this month, we'll be working on turning the regional data into part 1 of the plan. And if you look above at task 4, community outreach, you'll see, as Liz mentioned, we're planning a second regional presentation at the start of January. And there we'll present the results of the regional housing analysis and talk more about the process for the 830J plans. And the municipal workshops for the 830J plans will run through January and February, and you can expect to hear more about these events as we get into November. We anticipate to have the entire project complete by June 2022. And this is a really aggressive timeline, but it's driven by the statutory requirement that all of the 830J plans be completed by that time. So that's why we've assembled such an amazing team that's dedicated to making sure that we get this plan done and we get it done well. Next slide. So to sum up, these are the next steps in the process. We'll be continuing work on the regional data analysis. We'll be working on the projections for future housing needs and our recommendations. We'll complete the regional housing analysis, which is part 1 of the plan. And then we'll conduct the second regional presentation in January and kick off the 830J Annex component in January by virtually visiting each of the towns that are participating. And next slide. And I'll give it back to Sam to wrap it up with some concluding remarks.
All right, so I just want to thank everyone for participating, and I just want to encourage that we need more Theos in our region. So, I'm glad he was able to join us this evening. You will find the survey, which is still live, and a link to the recording of this presentation on the project website, which is rivercog.org/RHP. And so that survey responses will be used in the individual municipal annexes. So even though we presented data today as a snapshot of where that survey is today, those comments that we heard about not getting enough participation, we still have time to get more responses from the individual towns. If you have comments, you want to reach out to us, please email info@rivercog.org, but put a regional housing plan or RHP in the subject line. We also will have additional events over the course of this project. We will have another regional meeting in the winter, as Megan just mentioned, in January, and we would like your assistance in doing outreach in your towns for the municipal annexes that will go into details for strategies for affordable housing in each of your towns. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your interest tonight. We covered a lot of information, a lot of data. It is a little eye-opening seeing where we are, but that regional context is important in shaping what the issues are, what are the problems, and what are the solutions that we're going to recommend and find in each one of our towns to address those issues. So with that, let's go back. Next slide. We'll open up to more questions and answers. The consultant team is here. If you have more questions, so go ahead, Humphrey.
Okay, let me unmute myself. I think I'm
Yes.
unmuted. This question is for Don Poland. And the question is, do you have any data, either hard data or anecdotal data, on the impact that short-term rentals such as Airbnb, VRBO, that sort of thing, have on the availability of short-term, any impact that short-term rentals have on the availability of affordable housing?
Yeah, I will take a look at that, and I can definitely get some more concrete perspectives. I just did a plan in Stonington, Connecticut, also a coastal community with those. My general take is this. Your existing seasonal housing has a greater impact than the short-term rentals. So, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but when I was doing the data, Old Saybrook, Westbrook, your coastal communities have substantial seasonal housing. That's not surprising. That seasonal housing is probably a greater impact than the short-term rentals. That being said, my general statement to Stonington was that at the end of the day, that amenity value or desirability of the community from a tourism perspective really just kind of sends a message that we know one is it's gonna impact demand to some extent. And number two is it means you really just have to work harder at addressing, housing supply and housing demand than an inland community that doesn't have those same pressures. So, but I can look at some real numbers for you and get them out there in a revised version later. So.
Looks like we got a question from Paul McGinnis. Would like to look into if a remote workforce during COVID will drop off significantly or not. I think this is an important question and a trend, which we may see over the course of this project as more offices and workplaces go back to more in-person work. Obviously, remote work actually helps our region because it shortens the commute distance to nothing. But we do know that probably some sort of hybrid remote work is going to be with us as a permanent fixture of at least for office work. But we don't know what that impact will be. Although I think that remote work is generally a positive for us because of the high quality of life in our region. Let's see, we have some other comments from the chat that's being sent in. I'd be interested in hearing how RiverCOG can help promote economic development. As from what Dr. Poland shared, it's a larger and longer term driver of housing statistics and housing values. I'm echoing Mr. Tyler. It takes longer to type. All right. Thank you, Laurel. So I guess I'll go into a little bit. So RiverCOG, we just got notification that we will be receiving a grant from the Federal Economic Development Administration to create our first comprehensive economic development strategy plan, which is a federal economic development document that can guide federal investment in the region. This will update and replace our GrowSmart economic strategic plan, which didn't have that status with the federal government. So that's a project that we'll be starting this winter. Housing and economy go hand in hand. And in the GrowSmart plan that was completed 5 years ago, the 3 points of that triangle was housing, transportation, particularly public transportation, connecting to areas that had more rental and more affordable housing, and also jobs and economic growth. So those are the 3 elements that the GrowSmart plan identified as being key, and I think that remains. But that is something that RiverCOG is going to be engaged in, being able to bring more federal money, particularly from EDA, into our region to support some targeted investments. So other questions? I see Beth Emery. Go ahead. And you have to unmute yourself.
There, sorry, it took me a minute. So we just spent a lot of time coming up with a regional plan of conservation and development, and sustainability, natural resource protection, tree cover is part of that. And the housing development is incredibly important also, but will the plan address ways in which and points that can be made so that communities can still stay focused on the things that clearly we showed in our plan of development we were interested in, and work in harmony with increasing the right types of housing stock? How does that get balanced, and what are the suggestions for that?
So I think your question is, how do we balance, let's say, our natural assets, which are very valuable to attracting people to our region, while at the same time accommodating some new development? Is that the question?
Yep.
I think we have some redevelopment opportunities in our community centers, particularly in places that may be underutilized. We do have some areas where there could be greater density in some of our town centers. We've been watching a shift, particularly in retail, to online sales. There may be a little less need for some of the commercial space that we have that might provide some opportunities for redevelopment. And I think that should be encouraged, because those types of, let's say, a mill conversion will result in some smaller units, which might help provide some diversity in units. I don't think that necessarily increasing housing supply means that we have to jump to greenfield sites. But redevelopment has impediments, and those projects can be more complicated. And that's where identification of potentially some of those opportunities in our annexes and some of the techniques that towns can employ to make redevelopment easier is going to be key. I think just in general in the future, as we see some transformation in commercial, we may no longer need to be planning the same amount of parking, for example. For a retail parking is based on Christmas peaks, which may not be there anymore. So there may be opportunities to take existing impervious surfaces, whether they be buildings or pavement, and turn that into new opportunities. Other questions or comments? Don't be shy. All right, well, any other closing remarks from either our consultants, our consultant team, or RiverCOG staff before we head up? Okay.
Well, I just want to thank everybody again for hanging in with us tonight and for participating in our exercises. It's great to see so much interest in such an important topic.
For those, thank you all for registering for this presentation tonight. We will send you an update when the next meeting is scheduled, which is scheduled for sometime in January. And we will also look forward to you participating in the town process to create the Section 830J affordable housing plans as we work through the winter on those. So thank you again, and please reach out to us at info@rivercog.org. Please share this this recording and the project website at rivercog.org/RHP, and have a good night. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.